A low, trembling sound drifted across the dusty street long before anyone noticed where it came from. It wasn't loud enough to startle anyone, yet it carried a strange weight, like a quiet warning wrapped inside a breath. Those who heard it paused without knowing why, glancing toward the narrow road where the heat shimmered above the packed earth. It was the kind of afternoon where the sun pressed down so hard that even the wooden storefronts seemed to sag a little. People moved slowly, fanning themselves or leaning in whatever shade they could find. Nothing about the scene looked unusual at first, yet something felt off, like the moment before a sudden gust of wind turns the air restless. In the center of the road, a carriage rattled forward, its wheels creaking with every turn. A tall mare pulled it with steady steps, her chestnut coat dulled by dust and sweat. She had been giving rides since morning, carrying families, travelers, and anyone who couldn't bear to walk under the blazing sun. Most people barely gave her a glance, treating her presence as something ordinary. But a few noticed the way her strides had shortened, how her sides rose and fell too quickly, how her ears twitched as if she were trying to shake off the heat itself. A group of bystanders stood near a wooden bench, murmuring to one another, catching glimpses of her from time to time. Her driver sat upright on the carriage seat, wiping the back of his neck with a handkerchief. His shirt clung to him from the heat, and his patience had thinned as the long day dragged on. He kept glancing toward the corner where more customers waited, hoping to earn enough coins before the sun dipped low. Pressure pushed at him from every direction. The season had been slow. Repairs on the carriage were overdue, and competition along the main road grew heavier each week. The horse was his only steady partner, the one thing that kept his small work from falling apart. Even so, he whispered hurried commands under his breath, urging her to keep pace despite her exhaustion. A faint tremor passed through her legs. No one noticed it the first time. The second time, a young boy near the water trough tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed, but she brushed his hand away, thinking he only wanted attention. The mare blinked hard, her vision blurring as the heat swirled around her. She tried to steady herself, but the world tilted. Her hoof slipped slightly, leaving a small scrape in the dirt. She kept going, driven by habit and the hope of rest at the end of the road. A pair of friends sitting on a barrel near the general store leaned forward, sensing something wasn't right. One lifted a handheld device, ready to capture the bustling street the way tourists often did, unaware how important that simple decision would soon become. A few others began turning their heads, curiosity spreading quietly through the heat. People could tell when a moment didn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of the day. Even if they didn't understand it, they felt it. The mare's breathing grew uneven. Each inhale sounded like it had to pull through layers of fog. Her knees bent without her meaning to, and for a brief second she managed to catch herself. The driver noticed the sudden dip, frowning as he tightened the reins. He leaned forward, muttering a command for her to focus, to keep walking just a little further. But the world swayed beneath her hooves again, and this time there was no balance to hold on to. Her legs folded slowly, almost gracefully, as if she were kneeling, but the movement carried the weight of exhaustion rather than intention. A hush swept across the street. It was the kind of stillness that made even the air pause. People stared as she lowered onto her side, her chest expanding with heavy breaths. She wasn't hurt, she wasn't injured. She was simply overwhelmed by the heat, worn down to the point where standing became impossible. The driver reacted quickly, too quickly, his frustration boiling over as he jumped down from the carriage. His voice rose sharply, echoing off the wooden walls. The crowd flinched, sensing the tension tightening like a rope pulled hard from both ends. Several bystanders instinctively reached for their devices, recording the scene as their concern grew. They didn't want trouble, they didn't want harm. But moments like this carried weight, especially when a helpless creature was involved and someone responsible for her was not dealing with the situation gently. Eyes widened, hands hesitated. Some whispered to one another, unsure whether to intervene or keep their distance. They watched each breath the horse struggled to take, her ribs lifting and falling with an uneven rhythm. The driver tried to coax her up at first, speaking sharply, tugging at the reins. Sweat dripped from his brow as the heat pressed harder, turning the moment anxious and raw. A couple of people stepped forward but stopped halfway, uncertain if they were allowed to interfere. The mood shifted again when the driver's frustration turned into actions that made the crowd gasp. Nothing shown was graphic or dangerous, yet the tone of the moment made everyone tense. It was the kind of scene that made people angry, frightened, and protective all at once. The recordings caught every second, from the raised voice to the troubled reactions of the onlookers. The Mary lifted her head weakly, her eyes full of confusion. She didn't understand the noise, the hands waving, the strangers gathering. She only knew she needed rest. Her breath trembled as it left her body. A woman near the front covered her mouth, whispering to those beside her. A man muttered under his breath in disbelief, shaking his head. More people stepped forward now, forming a loose circle. No one wanted things to get worse. No one wanted to stand by and watch a creature pushed beyond her limits. Tension built quickly, rising like steam trapped under a lid. The driver felt the crowd turning against him, their silence heavy with judgment. He stumbled back a step, gripping the reins even though the mare couldn't move. His anger began to shift into something else, something unsettled and unsure. He glanced around as if looking for support, but found only stern faces and steady cameras pointed in his direction. Every breath he took seemed to echo louder than the last. The sun continued to scorch the ground, but the mood had turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather. The Murray lay still, not unconscious, not harmed, just overwhelmed. Her tail twitched lightly as a fly landed on her flank. The small movement reassured the crowd that she was still responsive, though clearly struggling. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang, but no one turned to look. The entire street was anchored to one moment, one unfolding problem, one rising conflict. Then someone pushed through the crowd, moving with purpose. No one recognized them at first. Their voice cut through the stillness, calm yet firm, addressing the driver, the bystanders, and the situation with a tone that demanded attention. The crowd shifted, murmuring quietly, unsure what this new arrival would do or say. The driver tensed, bracing himself as if expecting a confrontation. The Mare lifted her head slightly at the sound, her ears twitching. The tension thickened, pressing down on everyone as the new figure stepped even closer, stopping right beside the fallen Mare. People leaned in unintentionally, their devices held steady. Every breath, every word, every reaction felt like it would shape what came next. The street had become a stage, and the next moment was about to decide everything. But before anyone could understand what was about to happen, something unexpected broke the silence. A sharp whistle sliced through the thick silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange clarity that made every head turn at once. Even the Mare, lying in the dust with her sides rising and falling in slow, strained breaths, lifted her ears slightly. The newcomer knelt beside her without hesitation, placing a steady hand near her shoulder but not touching her yet. The calmness in the person's movements settled over the crowd in a quiet wave, easing the edge of panic but tightening the suspense at the same time. The driver stiffened, gripping the reins as if they were the only thing holding him together. His jaw clenched, and the uneasiness in his eyes flickered like a lamp running out of oil. He tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He was used to people complaining or hurrying him, but this moment felt different. This was a tension he didn't know how to handle. His frustration had already pushed the crowd against him, and now every breath he took seemed to echo the weight of his choices. The newcomer finally spoke, voice low and steady. They asked the driver how long the Mare had been working without a break. The question wasn't harsh, but it sliced through whatever defenses he still had left. He looked away, wiping his hands on his trousers as if the dust there demanded urgent attention. He muttered something about needing to earn enough for the day, about customers coming in waves, about not wanting to fall behind. His words didn't excuse anything, but they showed the thin rope he had been balancing on for weeks, maybe months. The crowd listened. Some softened a little at hearing the strain in his voice, but no one looked away from the Mare. Her breathing told its own story. Her coat carried the dullness of long days and little rest. Her hooves were worn more than they should have been. She wasn't a neglected creature, but she was a tired one, pushed harder than her strength allowed. The person kneeling beside her shifted slightly, lowering their voice toward the Mare. They whispered something that no one could fully hear, not words meant for people, but a tone meant to calm an exhausted animal. The Marae's eyes blinked slowly, her gaze softening. The crowd witnessed it with a kind of hushed reverence, like watching someone coax a flame back from the edge of going out. Behind them, a few bystanders exchanged murmurs. Some talked about how hot the season had been, hotter than anyone remembered. Some spoke about how many horses along the main road had been pushed hard due to the growing number of visitors passing through town. Others whispered about the tension earlier, the raised voice, the angry gestures that made several people start recording. They wondered what would happen to the driver now, if someone would report him, if he would lose his work, or if he would be given another chance. But something deeper stirred in the air, something that went beyond a single incident. This moment pulled back the curtain on a heavier truth simmering beneath the surface of the town. People had seen similar scenes before, though not always this publicly. Horses used for rides were part of everyday life, blending into the routine like the rhythm of wagon wheels on dirt. But each season seemed a little harsher than the last, and each year the pressure on the workers grew heavier. The newcomer finally placed a hand gently on the Mare's neck, not to force a movement but to check her pulse and breathing. Their brows tightened slightly, enough for those closest to notice. They asked again, this time more firmly, how long she had been working without proper water. The driver looked as if he wished the ground would swallow him. He spoke quietly, saying he had given her water earlier, though not recently enough. The crowd shifted uneasily, not sure what to believe. A woman stepped forward from the edge of the circle. She worked at the small feed shop nearby and recognized the Mare instantly. She explained softly that the horse was usually calm and hardworking, never causing trouble. She had seen the driver bring her in for supplies, always paying carefully, counting every last coin. She mentioned that he often spoke about how hard the year had been, how repairs drained whatever savings he had left, and how he feared losing his only source of work. Her voice didn't excuse him, but it added layers to the story unfolding in front of everyone. The tension hung like a weight suspended from a fraying rope. The crowd wasn't angry without thought. They understood hardship, they understood pressure. But they also understood responsibility, especially toward an animal that couldn't speak for itself. Several recording devices stayed pointed forward, capturing every gesture, every word, every breath. People whispered among themselves about what would happen if the situation spread beyond the town. Some thought it might push for changes long overdue. Others feared it would bring trouble more than solutions. The Mare shifted slightly, trying to lift her head again. The newcomer moved quickly, guiding her gently so she didn't strain herself. Her breathing remained heavy, but there was a spark of effort in her movement. That small sign made the crowd straighten, hope flickering quietly through the tension. The newcomer told the driver that she needed shade and water immediately. They spoke calmly, not accusingly, but there was no softness in their insistence. Another man stepped forward, offering to help carry a bucket from the nearest well. A teenager ran to grab a cloth soaked in cool water. Even small gestures felt important now. The crowd wasn't sure if they were helping the Mare recover or helping themselves feel less powerless. But either way, hands moved and worry guided them. The driver hesitated before allowing others to assist, pride wrestling with guilt. He didn't like losing control. He didn't like being judged. But he looked at the Mare lying helpless in the dirt, and something broke through the wall he had built around himself. He stepped aside, looking smaller than he had a few minutes earlier. His voice softened as he asked the newcomer what needed to be done, though shame edged his tone. As the bucket arrived, the Mare lifted her head slightly, but the newcomer stopped anyone from forcing her to drink too quickly. They explained that an overheated horse needed care and slow steps. The crowd listened closely, some learning these things for the first time. The driver listened too, brows drawn tight, absorbing the instructions with quiet intensity. Someone near the back of the crowd wondered aloud where the newcomer had learned so much. They didn't look like a veterinarian or someone from the local stables. They carried themselves differently, moving with careful intention, as if they had seen scenes like this before. The curiosity spread. People whispered guesses, wondering if the newcomer was passing through town or had lived quietly among them without drawing attention. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows across the street. The air remained hot, but a faint breeze stirred at last. Dust lifted in soft swirls around the Mara's legs. She shifted again, her hooves scraping gently against the ground. Her breathing steadied, though she still couldn't rise. The newcomer glanced toward the driver and asked calmly whether he had noticed any earlier signs of exhaustion. The question held no anger, only concern, yet it struck him harder than the harsher tones earlier. He admitted quietly that he had noticed her slowing down, though he tried to convince himself it was temporary. He thought she would get through the day if he pushed a little more. The regret in his voice didn't erase what had happened, but it made the crowd pause. A few people exchanged looks of understanding. They knew what desperation could push a person to overlook. They also knew that animals didn't deserve to bear the cost of human struggle. The newcomer finally stood, brushing dust from their knees. The crowd parted slightly, their attention fixed on every move. The driver watched nervously, his hands twisting the reins. The Murray lay with her head resting gently on her foreleg, breathing steadier but still unable to rise. Then, in a slow and steady motion, the newcomer pointed toward something behind the crowd. People turned, eyes widening as they noticed someone approaching from the far end of the street. The sight of that figure sent a ripple through the gathered onlookers. Some recognized the person immediately. Others whispered, unsure what their arrival meant. But the newcomer's expression hardened just slightly, as if they knew this moment would change everything unfolding here. The driver's face drained of color. The Murray blinked in confusion. The crowd stepped aside to make room, uncertain whether help or confrontation was about to walk straight into the heart of the tension. And just as the figure reached the edge of the circle, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next moment that was about to shape the fate of everyone involved. The figure approaching from the far end of the street walked with a slow, deliberate pace that made everyone tense. Dust rose beneath each step, curling around their boots before drifting away in faint spirals. The way the person carried themselves hinted that they weren't just another passerby stepping into a strange scene. There was a purpose behind their movement, something steady and unwavering that made the crowd instinctively make room for them. The driver swallowed hard, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes flicked from the newcomer crouched beside the Murray to the figure now stepping into the circle. He looked cornered, even though no one had spoken yet. He rubbed his hands together anxiously, gripping the reins as if they were the last thing tying him to stability. The Murray let out a faint breath, her ear twitching at the change in the crowd's energy. The newcomer at her side noticed too and rose slowly, turning to face the new arrival. Their expression shifted in a way the crowd couldn't fully interpret but could feel. Something old stirred in their eyes, something that hinted at a long history, whether with the driver, the town, or situations like this. The figure finally stopped just a few feet away. They removed their hat and held it at their side, scanning the Murray, the driver, and the circle of bystanders who watched with expectant silence. Their voice came low, steady, and edged with disappointment as they spoke the driver's name. The driver winced like the sound itself carried weight. A few whispers fluttered through the crowd as some recognized the newcomer now that the hat was off. They had been part of the town's leadership years ago, someone who understood the old ways of work animals, someone who had stepped back into a quieter life but still held respect. Without raising their voice, they asked the driver how long he had been ignoring the signs of the Murray's exhaustion. The question wasn't loud, yet it cut deeper than any shouting would have. The driver tried to explain himself, talking about rising expenses, fewer customers during the colder months, and the pressure to keep the carriage running so he wouldn't lose his spot along the main road. His words spilled out in a tangled rush, half excuse, half confession. But the newcomer didn't respond immediately. Instead, they turned to the Murray, lowering themselves to one knee. They studied her carefully, tracing the line of her ribs with their eyes, noting the tremble in her legs. When they finally rose again, their expression had hardened. They told the driver plainly that this wasn't just about one long day or a few poor choices. This was the result of a pattern that had gone unnoticed for too long. The crowd murmured again, feeling the tension thicken. The driver protested softly, insisting he cared for the Murray, that he fed her, watered her, tended to her hooves when he could afford it. His voice trembled as he tried to make himself understood. He wasn't a cruel man, just a desperate one, stretched thin by a life that seemed to demand more from him each week. Still, Desperation didn't ease the sight before them. The Mary remained on the ground, her ribs lifting and falling with tired breaths, her body coated in dust and sweat. The newcomer beside her placed a calm hand near her shoulder again, grounding her with gentle presence. A woman near the front, the one from the feed shop, stepped forward again. She offered context quietly, explaining how hard the driver had been trying to keep afloat. She spoke of the long hours she had seen him put in, how he often chose cheaper feed or delayed repairs because he simply didn't have enough to cover everything. She didn't make excuses for him, but she painted a fuller picture, one that softened some of the harsher looks from the crowd. Still, the scene couldn't be ignored. People recorded because they believed the incident mattered, not only for the mare but for the message it carried. The murmurs grew louder. Some suggested reporting what happened. Others feared the backlash might ruin the driver entirely. A few argued that animals used for rides deserved better protection, especially in harsher seasons. The newcomer listened to every voice, but their gaze stayed fixed on the mare. When they finally spoke again, they said the mare needed to be taken somewhere cooler, given time to rest, and assessed by someone with proper experience. They offered to help move her, but the problem didn't end there. The larger conflict hung over them like a cloud ready to burst. Who would decide what happened next? Who would take responsibility? And what would become of the driver if the incident spread beyond the street? The driver's shoulders sagged. He looked at the Mary with a mix of guilt and affection. He murmured her name under his breath, as if hoping she would lift her head just a little higher, show him she could stand and walk on her own. But she only blinked slowly, her breath still unsteady. A group of people began discussing what it meant for the town's reputation. The road had become a busy path for visitors lately, and scenes like this could spread quickly. The recordings in people's hands held power, and no one knew how it would be used. Some wanted accountability. Others wanted understanding. A few feared that one moment, captured from the worst angle, would overshadow months of honest effort from all the workers along the main road. The newcomer finally turned to the driver and asked a question that sent another ripple through the crowd. They asked when he had last taken the mare for a full health check. His silence answered before he did. The mare had been looked over months ago, back when work was slower and the weather kinder. He hadn't been able to afford another check since then. His voice cracked slightly as he admitted it. The tension grew fivefold. People felt the weight of that truth, the conflict between a man trying to survive and a creature depending entirely on him. The mare didn't understand money or pressure or deadlines. She only understood the heat pressing into her skin, the strain in her muscles, and the sudden shift from routine to collapse. A group of teenagers near the back whispered among themselves, unsure what to do. They cared about the mare, but didn't want the driver punished so harshly that he lost everything. One of them suggested forming a fund to help workers like him take better care of their animals, but the idea was lost in the rising conversation around them. Another teen suggested posting the recording not to shame him, but to raise awareness about the heat and the risks long hours pose to working animals. Different voices blended together: concern, frustration, sympathy, judgment, fear. Everyone wanted something different, and yet they all stood around one fallen creature who needed the simplest thing of all: rest. As the conversation swelled, the newcomer's gaze didn't leave the driver. They told him firmly that he couldn't continue this way. If he wanted to keep his work, he had to make changes, and not temporary ones. The driver looked down, nodding weakly, not because he wanted to, but because he finally understood the line he had crossed. The tension didn't ease, though. If anything, it settled deeper. There was no clear resolution in sight. The mare still needed help. The driver needed a plan he didn't yet have. The crowd needed answers no one could provide on the spot. Before anyone could speak again, a sudden sound broke the moment. A sharp clatter echoed from behind the general store. Heads snapped toward the noise. The mare's ears twitched. The driver flinched. Even the newcomer tensed. Someone rushed from the back alley, waving frantically and calling for help. Their face was pale and their eyes wide with urgency. They shouted that something had gone wrong near the stable at the end of the street, something involving another horse and a wagon tipped on its side. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some turned to leave immediately. Others hesitated, torn between staying with the fallen mare or running toward the new crisis. The driver looked torn apart, unsure which direction to turn. The newcomer exchanged a tense glance with the crowd, then with the mare, then with the direction of the new commotion. The road that had already felt heavy with tension suddenly felt even more fragile. 2 crises in one blazing day. 2 animals in trouble. 2 moments demanding answers the town wasn't prepared to give. And as people began to move, torn between duty and fear, the town's fragile balance wavered in a way that hinted nothing would be the same after the next decision was made. The shout from the alley cut through the street like a blade, leaving everyone suspended in a moment of disbelief. The person waving their arms kept calling for help, their breath scattered and uneven as they pointed frantically toward the end of the road. The urgency in their voice was enough to make the crowd split into confusion. Some took a step forward as if pulled by instinct. Others stayed glued to the fallen mare, unable to leave her side. The tension in the air stretched tight like a rope pulled too far. The driver looked torn apart inside. His eyes darted between the mare lying in the dust and the direction of the new crisis. Guilt weighed on him heavily, but something else flickered behind his expression too. A sense of dread that the situation was larger than he'd realized. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His throat tightened, his palms sweating as he gripped the reins even though they offered no control anymore. The newcomer by the mare stood slowly, the movement calm but edged with urgency. Their eyes scanned the crowd, then the road behind the general store, then the mare again. For a moment, it looked as though they might run toward the second crisis. But they hesitated. Their gaze fell on the mare's trembling flank, the faint but steady rise and fall that proved she was still fighting to stay responsive. The conflict was clear. One horse already needed immediate help. Another was in danger somewhere beyond the crowd. The town couldn't handle this much strain at once, not with the heat pressing down and tempers running thin. The people knew it too. Whispers spread quickly. What if the wagon accident was worse? What if someone was hurt? What if the second horse was trapped or panicking? What if there wasn't enough help to go around? The woman from the feed shop placed a steadying hand on the driver's arm. She told him quietly that the mare would not be alone. People here would stay with her. But he had to decide whether he would step forward to help at the alley or stay rooted in his guilt. His breath shook. He nodded once but still didn't move. Meanwhile, a few younger bystanders rushed toward the new crisis, their steps echoing through the street. Others followed after a moment of hesitation. The teen who had earlier spoken about raising awareness glanced back at the mare before jogging after the others, unsure if they were needed but unable to ignore the urgency. The crowd slowly thinned near the edges, though a core group remained tightly gathered around the mare, unwilling to leave her vulnerable. The newcomer crouched beside the mare again, examining her legs, her breathing, her attempt to shift. They whispered something gentle to her. She blinked and lifted her head a fraction. It wasn't enough to rise, but it showed she was aware of the care surrounding her. Just when the tension seemed to settle into a fragile balance, another voice called from the distance. It was someone returning from the alley, sweating and short of breath. They announced that the tipped wagon had blocked the narrow pathway entirely. The horse attached to it was standing but panicked, stamping in place. The person said the wagon had fallen awkwardly, tilting toward a dry ditch below, and if the horse pulled too suddenly, the whole thing might slide further. And at the end of that ditch was a cluster of old wood beams left behind from construction months ago. If the wagon shifted into those, it could collapse and injure the animal badly. A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. 2 major incidents in one afternoon, 2 animals in danger, 2 responsibilities pulling the town apart. The newcomer rose again, jaw tightening. They said the mare could not be moved yet, not without risking her strength failing completely. They needed someone with calm hands and clear understanding to go to the wagon site. Someone who knew how to handle a panicked horse. Someone who wouldn't make the situation worse. The crowd turned to the driver. He froze under their gaze. Shame burned through him, but so did something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath his fear this entire time. The mare needed him, but she needed rest more than anything. Another horse was in danger, and he was one of the few in town with real experience calming an animal in distress? The newcomer stepped closer to him. They spoke low enough that the crowd leaned in to hear. They said this was his chance to show the truth of who he was. Not the worst moment caught on a recording, not the frustration that had pushed him too far earlier, but the man who had spent years working beside animals, understanding them, depending on them, and honoring their strength even when life pushed hard. The driver's hands shook as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked at the Murray, her soft eyes blinking slowly. Her chest rose and fell in that steady, tired rhythm. He whispered something to her under his breath, a quiet apology and promise wrapped together. Then he handed the reins to the woman from the feed shop with trembling fingers. He took one deep breath and stepped away. The crowd opened for him, letting him pass through the circle. People watched him go with mixed emotions. Some doubted him, remembering the moment earlier when he acted out of frustration. Others believed in second chances, especially when the stakes were high. The tension didn't ease as he walked toward the alley. If anything, it rose higher. This wasn't a simple task. A frightened horse attached to a tipped wagon was unpredictable. One wrong move could send everything crashing. The Mare watched him go with a faint flick of her ears. The newcomer placed a gentle hand on her neck again. They spoke quietly, saying she wasn't alone, that help was coming, that she would be safe. The Mare's breathing steadied a little more. Back at the alley, the crowd that had gathered tightened around the edge of the ditch. The panicked horse near the tipped wagon tossed its head, the harness taut and trembling. Its hooves pounded the dry earth in sharp, uneven beats. People tried to stay calm, but were clearly on edge. The wagon hung halfway over the ditch, its wheels stuck in the dirt, threatening to slip if the horse jerked too hard. When the driver arrived, he paused at the entrance of the alley, taking in the situation. His face paled. A man standing nearby shouted for him to hurry, but he held up a hand, signaling for quiet. He didn't rush forward. He walked slowly, deliberately, letting the panicked horse see him approach. The animal's ears flicked forward, its breathing harsh. It sidestepped anxiously, the harness creaking with every movement. The driver spoke softly, his voice carrying a tone the crowd hadn't heard earlier. Gentle, focused, steady. He softened his steps, moving along the horse's side rather than directly in front of it. The horse tossed its head again but didn't pull suddenly. It recognized something in him, something familiar and calming. The people near the ditch watched with held breath. Even those who doubted him earlier felt their tension rise in a different way now. This moment mattered. If he failed, the horse could be injured. If he succeeded, he could redeem something inside himself that had been collapsing all day. Meanwhile, back on the main road, the Mare's breathing improved ever so slightly. The newcomer placed a cool cloth on her neck, speaking gently. The core group of bystanders remained with her, creating a barrier of quiet presence around her. The town felt stretched across two fragile threads, each one threatening to snap. The feed shop woman glanced toward the alley again and again, worry etched into every line of her face. She wasn't the only one. People still recorded, but their tone had shifted. They weren't looking for blame anymore. They were looking for hope, for clarity, for something that would make sense of the long, hot afternoon that had suddenly become a turning point for the entire community. Back at the ditch, the driver finally reached the horse's side. He placed a steady hand on its neck. The animal trembled but didn't shy away. He murmured calming words, guiding it to shift its weight carefully. The wagon creaked ominously, and the crowd gasped, but the driver held his ground. He began working at the harness straps with slow precision. One wrong movement could startle the horse. One sudden noise could make it lurch. The pressure grew with each second. And then, just as he began loosening the final strap, the wagon shifted again. A sharp crack rang out. The crowd shouted. Dust flew up from the ditch. The horse reared slightly, pulling back in fear. The driver's hands tightened around the strap. The Mare on the main road lifted her head in alarm. The newcomer looked toward the alley, worry slicing across their expression. Everyone froze. The entire town seemed to hold one breath together, waiting, listening, watching to see what would happen next in a moment so tense that even the wind stayed still. The dust had barely settled when the sheriff stepped closer, his boots making slow, careful sounds against the warm ground. The crowd around him stayed quiet, as if the weight of what they had witnessed still held them in place. The Murray stood close to the water trough, her breathing steady and calm now, her coat carrying the soft shine that came after a long day of fear finally easing away. The sheriff watched her for a moment before turning back toward the driver, who sat on a small wooden bench near the post, shoulders sunk low. He wasn't restrained or locked up. He just sat there quietly as if he wasn't sure what to do next. The town had its own way of handling things, and the sheriff believed in fairness more than quick anger. The man looked older in the shade, like the sun had drained something from him that he didn't know how to replace. The whispers moved through the crowd in small waves, but no one raised their voice. People were trying to make sense of everything, trying to find the edges of their own feelings without pushing too far. The Mare lifted her head when a soft breeze passed through, the kind that carried the smell of warm soil and hay from the nearby barn. The stable boy stood close to her, brushing her neck gently. His hand moved slow, steady. The animal leaned into him with a trust that couldn't be forced, and the crowd watched that simple motion with quiet relief. Her fall earlier had shaken the whole street. Seeing her back on her feet made the town breathe easier, though the tension still hung in the air like a thread that hadn't broken yet. The sheriff cleared his throat and everyone turned toward him. He had that way of commanding attention without raising his voice. He looked at the driver for a long moment, then said he wanted to hear the full truth. The man nodded, rubbing his hands together like he needed something to hold on to. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough but not angry. He explained how he had been behind on payments and how he feared losing his route. The days had been long, the heat unforgiving, and he convinced himself that pushing the Mare a little harder would help him catch up. He admitted that he had ignored her slowing steps and the small signs she had given. He said he regretted every part of it. People listened without interrupting. Some felt sorry for him, some stayed unsure, and a few kept their guard up. The important part was that he spoke honestly. The sheriff nodded slowly after the man finished and told him that the town had rules for the care of working animals and that he would face consequences, but they would be fair. The driver didn't argue. He said he would accept whatever came. His shoulders seemed lighter once the words were out, like he had finally stopped fighting something inside himself. The stable boy stepped closer to the sheriff and quietly asked if the Mare could stay in the barn for a few days. The sheriff agreed. He turned to the crowd and said anyone who wanted to help with her care could speak with the stable boy later. People murmured in support. A woman stepped forward with fresh cloths she had brought from her store. Another offered to bring water regularly. It was the kind of moment that reminded the town who they were when they stood together. The sheriff then told the driver he would need to attend to different work until he learned proper handling. Not punishment, but correction. The man stood up, and for the first time that day, he looked the sheriff in the eyes with clear understanding. He nodded again and promised to do better. It wasn't a grand promise, just simple and steady, which made it feel real. As the crowd began to move away, the Mare lifted her head again. Her ears flicked gently at the familiar sounds around her. The stable boy led her toward the barn, guiding her slowly so she wouldn't strain herself. People paused to watch her pass, grateful that she was safe. Some offered small smiles. Others spoke soft praises under their breath, not toward the boy or the sheriff, but toward the Mare for her strength. Inside the barn, the air felt cooler, the walls holding a quiet calm that the outside could never quite match. The boy settled her in a wide stall filled with fresh hay, then checked her legs and sides again. She stood steady, breathing deep, her eyes soft and relaxed. He whispered to her gently, promising she wouldn't be pushed like that again. Whether she understood the words or just the tone didn't matter. She lowered her head and let out a warm, calm breath. The sheriff came in a few moments later. He watched the Mare and then asked the boy how she was doing. The boy said she would be fine with rest. The sheriff nodded with relief. He said he planned to speak with the town council about setting new rules for the work routes, making sure no animal was out in the heat for too long at a time. The boy agreed it was needed. Too many days had passed where the sun had pressed too hard on everyone, people and animals alike. As the sheriff walked out of the barn, he spotted the driver standing by the road, watching the sky shift to warm shades of gold. He approached him, not as an authority figure this time, but as another man trying to understand something bigger than the moment. They talked briefly. The sheriff told him that change wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. The driver didn't say much. He just nodded again, quietly determined. When evening came, the town settled into a peaceful rhythm. Lanterns glowed from windows and the sound of voices rose softly from porches. The mare rested in her stall while the stable boy stayed nearby, checking on her from time to time. He noticed how calm she looked now, how the tension in her muscles had eased. He knew it would take a few days before she felt completely strong again, but she was safe, and that was what mattered most. A few townsfolk stopped by the barn that evening, bringing small offerings of fresh oats or clean water. They didn't stay long, just enough to show they cared. Word of what happened had spread quickly, and the story had touched more people than anyone expected. It wasn't just about the heat or the fall or the rush to record it. It was about responsibility, compassion, and the way a single moment could change the way a whole community thought about something they had taken for granted. The sheriff returned one more time before heading home. He placed a hand on the barn door frame, watching the mare for a moment. He knew the story would stay with folks for a long time. He hoped it would teach them all something important. Not through anger or blame, but through awareness. As the night settled in fully, the barn grew quiet. The mare shifted her weight, settling comfortably on her bed of hay. The stable boy rested his arms on the edge of the stall and watched her with a soft smile. The long day had finally found its end. The tension, the worry, the shock of the earlier hours had all softened into something gentler, something thoughtful. The town had learned, the mare had endured, and even the driver had begun a path toward change. The story didn't end with noise or blame. It ended with steady breaths, calm understanding, and a shared promise among the people who called that place home. The mare was safe. The driver had a chance to start over. The town had grown a little wiser. And in the quiet of the barn, under the soft glow of a lantern, it felt like things would be better from here on.